Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming today on this rather foggy day, actually, to hear a little bit about social media. So hopefully we can dispel some of those weather blues. But anyways, as Rosetta mentioned, I am the director of something called the Center for Complexity of Business. And I always take a split second at the beginning to explain a little bit about what that is, because that might not be obvious from the title. But the Center for Complexity of Business, our tagline is actually finding the simple rules in a complex world, right? And so what we try and do at the Complexity Center is figure out simple models that kind of help explain really complex phenomenon. And the reason why we're able to do that is because of the growth of computational power, right? Because we have such cheap computer elements, such cheap storage power now, we can actually simulate each and every individual in a complex system. So for instance, in our Twitter and social networks, right, we can simulate the decision that every single Twitterer makes and how they're going to decide whether to pass something on or to keep it to themselves or to go into a lambasting tirade against a particular company, and we can build a model at that level, right? The nice thing is we try and discern that to the simplest possible rules, but what we find is that when you build those models among thousands and thousands of agents, or millions in some of these cases, right, that you get very complex phenomena that comes out of it. So that's kind of what we're focused on. It's kind of an idea that kind of has found its roots from social science, right, and it kind of has this idea of let's build our simple models and then see what kind of comes out of it as a result. The other logo you might notice up here is this kind of somewhat graffiti-like SM3 logo. That's because all the research I'm going to be talking about today was actually sponsored by the National Science Foundation. We have a grant from the National Science Foundation to study the diffusion of information authority in social media. And so that's kind of where, that's the group that's affiliated with that. And SM3 stands for Social Media Micromodeling, again, building these models at the individual level. Before I get into the heart of the presentation, I wanted to mention that I kept the slide deck fairly short. It's only about 20 or 25 slides. We have an hour to talk, so I really encourage you to ask any questions you have along the way. I kind of want this to be scoped mainly based upon your particular interests and what you think of that might be interesting from what we're talking about. So the overall talk is called Influence and Trust, Who Follows Whom, and that there's actually going to be two subparts to the talk where we'll go through each of those separately. But before I get there, I want to talk a little bit about why I think social media analytics, business analytics, marketing analytics is very important. And it really comes from a notion that we call connecting the CMO to the CIO, right? That we really need to bridge the gap between marketing and information systems, right? The truth of the matter is that organizations have more data than they've ever had before, right? We know more about our customers, and we know what they're doing, how they're purchasing things online. We know what they're talking about through online media, and we need to start harnessing that data, right? We need to start understanding what's going on. And computational power and storage is cheaper than it ever has been before, so we now have the ability to actually process and analyze this data. This enables really large-scale big data analytics on what we're kind of looking into, right? And these can, for example, be used to gain new customers, stop customers from churning, find the right piece of information you need to complete a sale at that moment, right? A big, large sale. Analyze word of mouth, return on investment of your marketing, right? Try and figure out how much your marketing efforts are actually paying off in terms of the way people are actually learning about your company or your brand, right? And one thing, we were having a little discussion beforehand, a lot of people think that a lot of the social media only applies to B2C, right? But the truth of the matter is, as we were talking about, that that advertising spend in social media for B2B companies recently outstripped advertising spend for B2C companies, right? So this is clearly an area of growth, and there are some specific platforms out there that are really useful for B2B as well as B2C, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we get through today. Keep going today. Before we get there, I want to mention, of course, in the bigger growth, the bigger area, analytics as a whole is very useful, right? Doing digital marketing analytics is extremely popular and kind of analyzing what's going on. I'm going to concentrate mainly on social media analytics today. And what I have up here is a slide that just kind of shows all the different places where we can collect data about consumers and about customers and clients that we might be looking into, right? Yeah.
I know you would never guess this to look at me, but I'm older than some of the people. And I don't know what half this stuff is.
I'm about to start telling you exactly what this is.
It's interesting.
I may not know that.
Four of those apps are beer related.
Well, I actually put that up there for a specific reason. So there's a whole group of stuff up there that's completely general, right? But what I wanted to point out, the reason why I have the beer-related ones up there, is that there's a bunch of niche markets for just about every single vertical you can think of, right? And when I'm pointing out the beer-related ones up there, there's 4 social networking sites devoted to craft beer, right? Like this is a small niche market, kind of growing market, right, of the overall beverage industry. But you have 4 different social media avenues that talk about nothing but beer, that if you're interested in that kind of, if that's what your market happens to be in, right, if that's what you deal with, you should be paying attention to all 4 of these. So what I'm putting this up is that I should encourage you to move beyond just the general social media apps, which we'll talk about in a second, and to also look at the niche apps that might be relevant to your particular vertical in your particular industry. Right? So yeah.
I'm older than Karen, so thank you, Lisa. How do you find these different niches?
Yeah, so I mean, in this case, it's a matter of just having someone in your organization who's kind of devoted to going out and finding this kind of information. A lot of this, for instance, I'm a home brewer, right? So that's the reason why I know about the beer apps in particular, right? And so I happen to follow people on Twitter who talk a lot about craft beer, and then one of them will mention one of these apps, right? Like Pintly or Free Beer, things like that. I then find that, I go on, and I kind of start exploring it through that way. You can, I mean, it's amazing how much you can turn up just by a simple Google search on some of these. If you type in your vertical and you type in social media, social networking, things like, it used to exist, it's no longer around, called Ski Space, right? So if you type in ski and social media, if you're in the ski industry, right, Ski Space used to be one of the ones that showed up right away, right? So you can get access to these kind of things just through kind of doing some simple groundwork and searching. What was it?
There's no yellow pages.
There's no yellow pages, there's no directory. I mean, in fact, as we'll talk about, social media is a very, very broad brush, right? And so, for instance, you know, we'll get into it for the general ones, but for the beer-related ones, Beer Advocate and Rate Beer, these are kind of websites where people go on and they post reviews, they're really in-depth content. Pintly is one where it's more like I have some friends and I drink a beer and I let my friends know that I'm having that beer, and then I can follow where they were drinking that beer, things like that, right? Untapped is similar in that respect, right? So you can get very different kinds of aspects, and I don't think anyone would classify all of these under the same labeling, right? And so it's very difficult to find that out. But let's get back to the more general ones, right? These are the ones that probably are more useful for a wide variety of people, right? So the one I put up on the far left is blogging, right? And blogging is something everyone is somewhat familiar with at this stage, where you just kind of write an article, you say, this is what I'm interested in, this is what is going on with my particular views, right? Blogging comes from an old word called weblog, right? It became shortened to blog. It was a way for people to keep track of their day-to-day events or their diaries, kind of online diaries. And then it became much more sophisticated. It became somewhat a political tool in cases, and then it became a marketing tool, and it kind of evolved from there. And now, you know, there's a blog created just about every second, if not faster than that. Those stats are actually fairly old at this point. And so you can find really rich, detailed data about what people think about a particular corporation, a particular brand, from just monitoring blog spaces out there as people are talking about these things. They tend to be the most in-depth, right? Really long content that's created there, but it's someplace that every kind of organization should be paying attention to. The one in the background here is Foursquare, right? Foursquare is a geolocation-enabled social media, so you basically can go to a location, you can check in and say, I am here, I'm at this place. From a point of view of local businesses, this is a very useful social media site. You can take control of your local Foursquare site, and then you can find out how often people are checking into your website, or checking into your location, how long have people been there. You can offer discounts, you can offer promotions to your consumers, to your customers, enabling them to actually encourage them to come back. And they can even, Foursquare, the analytics are really nice with Foursquare. You can actually do things, excuse me, for instance, notice the customer hasn't returned in a while, right? and then tell them, hey, here's a coupon for the next time you come in, or a promotion for the next time you come in.
Well, who are you telling this to? I mean, when you're on this Foursquare,
Yeah.
are you in a restaurant and you're telling your friends?
Exactly.
What I'm
You've
at,
got it exactly.
whatever,
Yeah.
I'm at Bruce Chris and I'm having a great steak.
Exactly. You can do that. Would be a great example of using Foursquare, right? And people.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure I understood.
No, you understand it correctly. And I mean, this kind of gets somewhat into why do people use social media in the first place, right? Why do people engage in these activities? And part of it is because of the need, the internal human need for people to socialize, right? They want to be with friends. They want to know about other people who like the same things that they do, right? So being on Foursquare is one way for you to do that, right? You have all your friends. You can see where they're going to eat. You can see whether you want to join them, right? You can. It was actually the predecessor to Foursquare was something called Dodgeball, right? Another playground game, if you will. And the idea, Dodgeball existed before the advent of smartphones. And so with Dodgeball, you would actually text message to a local service that, I'm in at this particular location, and they would text message your friends for you saying, hey, Bill's hanging out at Ruth Chris, right? You should go have dinner with him, or something like that, right? And so that's kind of the general idea.
You just type in Foursquare.com.
You can type in Foursquare.com, it'll get you right to the website. Right?
So that's how all those kids showed up at my house?
Yeah.
This is just a really interesting dialogue to me because I'm older than some of the folks in this room, and I'm also younger than others. And so I understand both sides. I understand your questions.
Yeah.
But I also understand how to use these tools too.
Yeah.
So how do you, it's one of the challenges we're facing.
Yeah.
How do we convince the senior leadership in our organization of the value of something that just sounds like a stupid idea to some people?
Yeah. So we actually are running into a similar problem on the research side of things, right? We're trying to convince a bunch of individuals that doing research in this space is actually very valuable, right? And one of the ways that we found to go around doing that is basically to do prototypes, do test runs, right? So say, hey, I know you don't want to dive in full on and kind of really devote something, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out and do a bunch of studies, and I'm going to basically show you what kind of information you could possibly get from this, right? To give you an example, we did some work with Mars, right, on social networking, and what we analyzed a bunch of data that they had from Facebook on Mars, and they were just astounded at the results that we could give them, right? That what we could tell them about how people were engaging with the Mars brand, how they were paying attention to Mars advertisements on Facebook, right? They were already devoting energy and efforts to this, right? But we were able to go beyond that to tell them more interested.
Showing them the real data that you can glean.
Exactly. I don't think these are interesting because there's all this data out here, right? I think this is interesting because of the way it might change your business decisions as a result of analyzing the data that's there, right? Yeah.
I think we've all personally learned about LinkedIn. We all have our little resumes up there and pictures, and we belong to groups and things. But just take Twitter, for example. Twitter's been around 5-6 years now, at least. And I'm B2B, I've been involved with it. But there is a site called Listorious, Listorius, where you can go and you can type in anything like, widgets, whatever, and it'll bring up every company and every person that has ever tweeted about widgets or in their profile mentions that they're an expert in widgets, or they sell widgets, or they use widgets. And you'll be able to see, oh my God, there's my competitor. Oh my God, there's the guy I saw at the conference last year that was the keynote speaker. I mean, you're going to see all these people that are already involved in your vertical, your company, in your product category, whatever, that are using Twitter very, very successfully. It's been used in sales, it's been used in customer support. So I would encourage you to do that and then show the powers that be. Right. Hey, look, this whole ecosystem of our world is in the Twitter sphere. Right. The conversations are going on there with or without us, so what are we going to do?
Yeah. So, and that brings up a great point, which is that all of the social media analysis is not just important from the point of view of finding out about your consumers necessarily, it's also important for finding about yourself, right? Obviously doing some self-examination of how your brand is being perceived online, and it's very important for competitive elements, right? Finding about how your competitors are being perceived and understanding what they're doing that you're not, or that what they're doing wrong that you could do better, or what they're doing right that you should be doing better either way, right? So, yeah.
Before I came to Smith, I used to work in publishing and for literary nonprofits, and one of the industries that has really been using social social media and understand a revitalization of social media in terms of helping that industry grow is in publishing. Because a lot of authors have been using different kinds of social media tools to think about how can they connect with their audience, how can they connect with their readers, and they're finding that the more engaged they are with their readers, the more likely people are to respond to them, to pick up their book, to follow them, go to book signings and whatnot. So that's one industry that's really seeing, and you can use that as, I mean, not that my research is bad, but you can use that as sort of concrete research of how social media is helping sort of create and revitalize an industry.
Yeah, and in fact, we have a kind of parallel to that. We've done a study of emerging bands, rock bands, right? And we followed everything they've ever said, basically on Twitter. And what we've found is that it's very interesting. Those who engage, it's not as important what the actual bands say on social media. What's important is what their followers say about them on social media. That seems to have a bigger effect on their overall sales and performance than what they're actually doing in their engagement. One thing we found, though, is that in order to encourage those fans to really be involved in social media experiences, they need to engage in a very different way than we normally think of marketing, right? We traditionally think of marketing as essentially building brands and building identity with our customers, building our relationships. A lot on social media, because of the fact that people want to be on there not necessarily as a sales channel, but also as kind of a community channel. They don't like to see people selling all the time to them on social media. So the bands that we found that do the best are ones that kind of balance this autobiographical kind of interesting information about myself notion with the amount of sales and informational content they put out there. So let's talk about a couple other of these general notions, just general platforms, just because I think it's interesting some of the discussion we're getting into here. So YouTube, obviously a lot of people think of YouTube as just a video sharing site, right? But it's also one of the largest social networking sites. People actually become members of YouTube, they can follow other members, they can follow brands and companies, and they can see what kind of video content they're putting up there, right? This actually is another great element of B2B marketing, right? It's a great way for you to establish thought leadership in a particular area. It's a great way for you to kind of present yourself to your clients in a way that they normally wouldn't get to see you, right? Which is in a video format as opposed to a lot of the more static formats out there. And of course, LinkedIn in the bottom right there that we mentioned, right, is a great both for B2B and B2C, right? Kind of a way for you to develop a personality online in a professional space, which is really what LinkedIn is devoted to, right? It allows you to kind of make content available to other members of LinkedIn who are following you. And it's a great way to present very professional kind of white paper type of content that you might not necessarily have another avenue to explore with. And then I kind of deliberately left to last the three at the top. Facebook, of course, is the one everyone is aware of, right? And Facebook is the one that everyone is a part of, right? But Facebook is becoming interesting in and of itself for a number of different areas, right? First of all, for the ability for you to market your brand and your organization using it. But there's a lot of little interesting niche markets that are coming about, right? So this is one of the things I wanted to mention, which is the idea of social gaming, which is another area that's kind of really growing. People are engaging in things like Farmville on Facebook all the time, right? And let me just pull up this number really quickly and bring it up real quick. So in Facebook, in Facebook, Farmville currently has 23 million daily users, right? So there are 23 million people logging into Farmville on a regular basis. There's 5 million people logging into Farmville on a regular basis. But that's only the second largest farm simulating social game out there. The number one, the largest farm simulating social game, does anyone know what it is, by the way? It's a Chinese farm simulator called Happy Farm. Happy Farm has 23 million daily users, right? So 4 times the size of Farmville, right? This is an extraordinarily growing area of industry, right? Essentially, there's millions of dollars being poured into social games, to social gaming identities. And the interesting thing about it is that these games are a lot of them are branded, right? They carry a brand association with them, and that brand is used to kind of provide more content, more information about the overall company and organization that they're associated with, right? Along these lines, we might as well, it's a good thing to mention, 23 million daily users in China playing Happy Farm, right? There was a recent study that showed that social media is actually more addictive than alcohol and cigarettes, right? And so it's actually one of these things that's growing in terms of the way people are actually using it on a daily basis and the number of frequency with which people check this. Twitter is another one. We mentioned a lot Twitter. Twitter has essentially become a news gathering platform and personal sharing experience. And so people a lot of times will find the best URLs they find online and share them with their followers. But the number of people on here, again, is huge, right? So the Justin Bieber and Lady Gaga tend to duke it out for who has the most followers at one point. I actually gave a talk about 2 months ago at the Baltimore CEO Club, and at that point, Justin Bieber was winning. But recently, Lady Gaga has surpassed him again. Lady Gaga now has 23 million followers on Twitter, meaning that meaning that there are more people following Lady Gaga on Twitter than there are people in North Korea, right? And so if the Lady Gaga nation was declared a nation in and of itself, it would in fact be the 58th largest nation in the world, right? These are huge numbers of people, huge audiences that you can reach to in this space. And finally, the one I left for the very last, because it's kind of the new up-and-comer, it's the hot topic that a lot of people are talking about, is Pinterest. And what Pinterest is kind of a different take on a lot of these different aspects. On Pinterest, you share pictures. So you pin a picture to a bulletin board. You can then share that bulletin board with your friends, right? The demographic tends to be highly female. It also tends to be kind of mothers and working class moms in that kind of era. So it works out, it's a very interesting demographic compared to a lot of the other social networking sites out there. It's also interesting in that it has a high marketing element, right? Because it's so visual, right? You can really try and emphasize getting your pictures pinned from your website to different other pin boards and kind of expressing your brand and getting your brand's reach out there in that way. So I hope I gave you kind of a brief overview of a lot of the major social media platforms that might exist out there. From here, we'll kind of dive in a little bit deeper as to some strategies and kind of areas you might want to explore. But before I move on, are there any questions about what these different platforms?
Well, I am kind of interested
Yeah.
because I think that there's an interesting stratification in this room.
Right.
So I frankly, wouldn't have no idea what a, Twitter or, I'm an in, but I don't know what I perhaps in.
Yeah, you're just on LinkedIn, okay.
So to reach with your business to business or your business to consumer,
Yep.
you're reaching, I would think, kind of a different, so how would you interest someone like me?
So you're reaching. So how do you on the flip side of it? How do you actually engage consumers who might not? And I think the one thing is putting good content out there, right? So you got to figure out what content. If this is someone who is never going to engage, has never engaged in Facebook and never engaged in Twitter before, one of the most popular ways of getting them to sign up is by offering something that's only available through those venues, right? And so. For instance, you offer a really good deal or a coupon, or you offer some sort of special, or you offer some content, right? A white paper that you can only get if you're logged into Facebook, if you're following us on Facebook, right? And the way, now with the timeline's a little bit different, but it used to be possible that you could set up Facebook so that they would only get that content if they actually had created an account and liked you and did things along those lines, right? And so, that's one way to engage people, obviously, on here. Another way is to, all of these tools allow you to take the data that's on these tools and also present them on your normal website, right? So you can have a Twitter feed running down the side of your website saying, here's what people are talking about our organization on Twitter, right? Now, maybe someone who came to your website who wasn't, on Twitter might see what's going on there, engage in the platform through that way, and then become a follower as well, right? I should say, you're right, for all of these, there is a skew in terms of the demographics, clearly, right? 18 to 29-year-olds still make up the largest fraction of social media users, right? But the largest growing group is actually those over the age of 59, right? Because it was small to begin with, and it's been doubling almost on a regular basis recently, right? What? And they have time, right? So it's a very large growing part of this. You're right. It's skewed right now. I don't know how long that skew is going to last. Honestly.
Because those 29-year-olds will become 30.
Yeah, exactly.
40, but it'll grow,
Yeah.
I assume.
Yeah, so I do think there are ways, though, to bring people in who aren't engaged on these platforms, right? And get them to.
And as a practical matter, and on an organizational level, you go out and you hire a marketing director who knows how to use these things for your particular product, and that marketing director also trains you. We've actually done that in our law firm. And we've been trained on do's and don'ts of LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera, actually each one individually. And the lawyers have all been trained.
Yeah.
Now, what we do with it is another issue.
Yeah.
But it's important to have within your organizational structure, if you don't know yourself, a person who actually knows how to use these and tailor them to your particular.
And might I suggest Smith School of Business marketing majors as a potential area for this, right? We offer both at the undergraduate and at the MBA level internet marketing courses that will help people gain the knowledge they need to do.
So our marketing director is very young.
Yeah. That works out well.
We don't know how to use these things.
But I agree. A lot of times, I mean, half of these tools I find out about the best ways to use them or the ways they're being used by the undergrads I teach on a regular basis, right? They tell me things about what's going on here that I didn't even know about, right? To give you an example of this, on Facebook, a lot of them maintain two separate personalities. One for their parents, the friend, and one for their friends, the friend. So.
My son just gave me access to his Facebook. But it's not the right one.
Exactly.
But I think that's true in the professional world as well. I mean, people tweet, to represent their companies or their role in the company.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they have other tweet
Yeah,
ideas for
yeah.
their friends and families.
And that gets into from a computational side of things. We've referred to this as entity identification, right? Making sure that the entity that we're looking at is the same entity we might be seeing in other areas, right? And that becomes a very difficult problem to solve. But there are ways to start to do some of that, right? To see both in some cases you might not want to. You might only need to see the business side,
It might not be
right?
relevant at all.
Yeah, and sometimes it might not be relevant at all. But at times you might be interested in what they're saying on the personal side of things as well as on.
To that effect, I have 2 Twitter accounts. I have one that's like, hey guys, I'm going out tonight, so where is everyone going to be? And then I have one that I already took a photo, Instagram, had it sent to my Twitter and my Facebook saying, add this social media presentation. And so, I have one that I talk about, I read this article, it was really interesting, and it's much more industry focused. And then I had one that I just had my friends follow. We all just follow each other, see where everyone's doing, what everyone's up to. And they're 2 completely different entities. I don't think anyone that sees me in the business world wants to know where I'm going to be or tonight.
Yeah.
So you told everybody you know that this is where you are this morning, and you put a picture of
In a certain
yourself?
circle.
I did a picture right here, and then I called it Influence and Trust at the Smith School. And then so now everyone knows that I'm out at learning about social media and trying to spread my knowledge. So.
Yeah, before I walked in the door this morning, I checked in on Foursquare that I was here at the Smith School of Business.
I'm curious,
right?
who all did post a status update?
I almost stepped in on Facebook, but then I couldn't do it fast enough and got distracted. I was thinking about it, checking in, saying where I am.
One thing I haven't done yet, but I'm planning to do in the fall for the first time is actually encouraging my students to live tweet during class, right? So they can actually be on
They're not
Twitter.
paying attention.
Well, but they are paying attention to me. Hopefully, I can monitor them better because I can look to see what they're actually tweeting during class, right? So. But yeah, and the nice thing is that it's kind of the new form of note taking in a way, right? They have to process the information, come up with what they're, discern it down to 140 characters, which is not as easy as it might seem, right? And then post it up there as a status update.
So it's like a little GPS or something.
I didn't say my address, but I did say at the Smith School, and it's real. Yes, I guess if you followed me enough, you could sort of figure out, like, I have red bricks on the side of my house because I've taken a picture outside of my house and went out with the number or anything. But you can sort of figure out where I am in general. I'm sorry?
Did anybody respond to your?
I haven't checked yet.
Does anybody care?
You know, maybe not, but at least if somebody were to look me up, I have the same username on my Facebook, my Twitter, my Pinterest, which I'm obsessed with, by the way, my Instagram. It's all the exact same username throughout everything. So if someone finds me on one, they can easily look me up, sort of see what I'm talking about and all the good stuff.
Right, and I mean, it becomes essentially an online resume, right, for you, right? This becomes your social media resume, and that's the way I encourage my students to think about it in my electronic marketing classes, right? Is to think of building your presence online, right? When you go out there to present yourself to the world, right, you want people to be able to find out things about you, like be a representation of yourself, right? And this is one way to do it. And the truth of the matter is it's going to happen regardless. People are going to search for you online regardless of whether or not you want them to. So you might as well have good content up there that actually you think accurately represents what you're interested in, what you do, rather than finding whatever happens to randomly be up there and not getting a good picture of you. You got to take control of your social media identity, and that's something I encourage all my students to do. Yeah, so let's get to the main part of the talk, now that we've kind of done a little bit of an overview of social media. A little bit. No, this is great, I love this, right? And in fact, this will work out well. So, these are I always put some teaser slides at the beginning to kind of give you an idea of where I'm planning to go, right, as we go through this talk. And as I'm labeled the talk, right, trust and influence, those are really the two big areas I'm going to talk about today. And so the first question is, who are the most influential individuals in social media, right? And the little teaser answer is it may not just be those who have the most friends, right? They may not be as influential as some of the other people you might see in social media. And the trust question I'm going to ask is, how is trust earned in social media? And the little kind of tidbit I'm going to give you there is that it's not necessarily something that is just a natural outcome of the network around. You can actually, as a marketer, take control over the way trust is evolving around your brand and try and encourage more trust in your situation. And that's kind of I'll leave it at that point, and we'll go on from there. So, influence work, and I should mention briefly, this is joint with a former student of mine who's now at Centre College, Forrest Stonedahl, and a professor at Northwestern University named Uri Walensky, and supported by the NSF, as I mentioned. So now that we've talked a lot about social media, we've talked about whether or not anyone cares about what's going on in social media, right? One way to measure whether or not anyone cares is how often messages get repeated, how often messages keep getting talked about, right? How often people enter into conversations in social media. So we can spin this question around and we can ask, who are the most influential? Who are the ones causing those conversations to occur in social media, right? How does the network structure, in other words, how does who friends whom on social media affect that influence level, right? Is it better for me to have 1,000 friends that I just pick kind of randomly? Or is it better for me to have a few key friends who I want to directly influence, right, on social media? Well, we're going to argue, and getting back to the complexity notion that I started out, we're going to argue that if we can simulate the decision-making process at the individual level, right, if we can understand what's going on at that individual level, then we can answer these kind of questions. Yeah?
When you think about this, are you also thinking about organizations or businesses as individuals in a network? Meaning, what is the value of it? Because they're an individual entity, right? Or like a brand or something has, or stuff.
So we're not separating individuals from brands. We're just thinking about a person producing content on a social network, right? Most of this work is probably going to make more sense in the context of individuals, right? A consumer network. But you could think about it as brands or, actually one place where I started with this work a long time ago was actually individuals within an organization, right? And thinking about if you want to affect positive change in your organization, who are the people that are most influential in that space, right? And I think the same model applies there as does to the general social media space. So this question, who is the most influential, can be thought about in this way, right? If I want to influence a network to kind of move towards one particular notion, I can concentrate my marketing efforts on a particular subgroup of that network, right? We call this seeding the network, right? I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to a couple of key individuals and kind of convince them that really they should be thinking about my organization or my brand to really kind of do what they want. In the case of consumer goods, right, this could be giving away free product, right? It could be that I'm just going to walk into a place and give away a couple of samples to some individuals to encourage them to think positively about the brand, right? In fact, there have been notions that people have done this in the guerrilla marketing, viral marketing space in the past, where they've, for instance, gone to high schools and observed who's the person with the most friends, and then gone and given them a free Game Boy, for instance, or something along those lines, right? To try and encourage word-of-mouth buzz to spread about that particular case. So which individuals that could you see that will allow you to reach the widest audience possible, right? And the standard rule of thumb in most of these scenarios is that you want to see the individual who has the highest number of connections, the people with the most friends, right? So to take this back to the high school example again, I grew up in the Midwest, you know, in Ohio and Michigan, right? And in the Midwest, if you go to the high school, when I was growing up, probably the person with the most friends was the captain of the football team, right? That was the person who knew the most people in the entire school, right? So the standard rule of thumb in this space is that that's the person you should approach, right? That's the person you should be giving the free Game Boy to or whatever that you're trying to encourage product adoption for. But there's some alternative strategies that you might consider, right? You might consider, for instance, seeding people whose friends don't know each other, right? So for instance, let's say that rather than giving it to the captain of the football team, who probably knows all the people on the football team, right, and maybe all the cheerleaders and all the other associated band members and stuff like that, you give it to someone like the kicker on the football team, who also happens to be in the Spanish club, right, and knows all the people in the Spanish club as well, right? So he knows that he might know fewer people overall, but he knows a disjoint set of individuals, right? You might also think about people who are somehow located at what we'll call the center of the social network, right? They might have a very few number of friends, but it happens to be that if you look at the number of steps it takes to get away from them to the other people in the network, it's the smallest number of steps overall, right? The friends of their friends of their friends tend to encompass the most number of people in the overall network, right? So we thought about this and we tried to phrase this and ask the question, who should we see? What should be our viral marketing strategy is one way to think of it. A counterpoint to that is asking how many people should you see, right? So if you give away lots of free product, right, then you're going to encourage your message to spread like wildfire through the entire high school, right? It's going to catch on, it's going to go to everybody, right? But every time you seed it into additional person, and whether this be free product or whether this be marketing efforts on your part, right, that costs you money, right? That costs you more effort, costs you more time. And at a certain point, the people you're going to start seeding you're going to be cannibalizing your own sales, right? You're going to be cannibalizing people who you would have naturally sold to without seeding them, right? Or they would have bought the product without you marketing directly to them anyways, right? And so there's this natural trade-off that occurs. So we can ask the question, how many people should we seed? How many people in the overall network should we focus our efforts on? And this is just a quick, so what we did was we built an agent-based model, a simulation of a bunch of individuals, and this is a movie I'm about to take you through of one of the simulations of diffusion going through that network, right? And this is Twitter. This is a real Twitter network. We extracted it from Twitter, showing all the connections between individuals for 1,000 individuals in Twitter. And they're going to adopt, well, in this case, we call it the purple hat, just because that happened. You'll see why in a second, right? But we're going to seed a couple of individuals with the purple hat, and then we're going to let the diffusion spread through the network. And in reality, this is just kind of a nice eye candy piece of simulation showing what's going on. But the important thing to note is that there are these different clusters in the right? Different groups in the network. And you'll see that once it really permeates one of those clusters, it starts to spread really quickly through that cluster to the entire group, right? And what we see, what we know from social networks, from social media, is that in fact this clustering-like structure is very, very common. That we see a lot of these kind of big clusters that exist in social media and social networks. So that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. So we ran a bunch of simulations as to what would be the optimal budget for allocating to individuals in social networks on a whole bunch of different social networks, right? And the interesting part, this has a lot of interesting data on it, but the most interesting part that you'll notice is that Twitter, right, which was that network I just showed you, is way down here at the bottom right. And what does that mean? What that means is that if the network is very, very skewed, in other words, if there are individuals, if there are a small number of individuals who have a lot of friends, and a lot of individuals who have a very small number of friends, you don't need to seed very many individuals in the overall network, right? And the reason why this is, if you think about it, right, is that if I'm really good at finding the most influential people in the network, right, and I have a highly skewed distribution of friendship, right, in other words, there's a few people who are very powerful, then all I have to do is convince those people to adopt the product, and the product's going to spread like wildfire throughout the entire place, right? And what we found in a repeated set of experiments is that most real-world social networks tend to be like this, right? You can imagine lots of other possible structures, and that's what all these other points along this line are, right? As to how the way social networks could be set up. But in fact, most social networks aren't set up like that. Most of them have this highly skewed distribution where there's a few very powerful individuals. That's good in one sense because it means that we don't have to spend a lot of money on seeding or marketing if we target well. But it's bad in the sense that it means we really got to spend a lot of effort to identify those powerful individuals in the overall network, right? And so that's kind of the trade-off that we naturally get in this situation. So how should we identify who should we be seeding in these social networks? And this was an interesting result. In almost every single network we looked at, right, seeding the person who had the most friends was the best solution. It didn't matter, right? It didn't matter what you did. We tried every possible other strategy that we could think of, right? And if you just gave the product away to the person with the most friends, no matter how central they were in the network, no matter how disparate their groups of friends were, then that worked out the best of all of them, right? Except for one of the networks that we looked at, and that was Twitter. And in Twitter and in other real-world social networks we've looked at a couple since then beyond Twitter, what we found is that seeding the person with the most friends wasn't nearly as effective as seeding the people who had lots of friends but whose friends didn't know each other, right? So what we found was that you needed to make a trade-off between the individual who had the most friends overall and people who had a fairly high number of friends but whose friends were in disparate groups in the system, right? And yeah.
What was the method that you used to get people to show the method?
What was that?
What was the method that you used to do this?
What was the method that we used?
Method.
Matches? Measures that we used to do this. I'm not sure what you mean by measures in this.
Like, did you give somebody a coupon?
So I should say that most of this is based upon, we can't obviously run these simulations thousands and thousands. We can't obviously run coupon type promotion giveaways millions of times. This actually required over 1 million different simulations to get to these results. Instead, what we did was we built a model that performed similarly to the way real diffusion processes have worked in the past, where people have given away messages and seen them spread. We built a model that we validated against that real data, right? We then took that model that we had previously validated, and then we tried all these different strategies. So this is all, that part of it is simulation, right? It's a model based upon real data, right? But once I'm exploring these kind of things, I'm actually talking about simulation. What's interesting is some colleagues of mine in Germany, right, have actually gone out and tried some of these strategies, right? Not working directly with me, but independently on their own. And they have results that basically back up what I'm saying. So they basically have shown when you go into a telecom network, which is what they work with, and start giving away, you know, if you text message your friend such and such, they'll get free minutes on their phone or something like that, right? And they tried different seeding strategies. their results tend to follow in line with what I'm about to say, right? Which is that the optimal strategy for seeding this network is in fact not to seed the people with the most friends, but to seed people who have a lot of friends, but whose friends don't know each other. And in fact, you can place this trade-off exactly, and the results are pretty robust to the different real-world social networks that we've looked at. That about 75% of your weight, to 2/3 to 75% of your weight, should be on the number of friends an individual has, and about 25% to 33% should be on how differently related those friends are, right? So how different clusters they have. So in other words, you don't want to take the person who has the most friends in the network, you want to take the person who has around 3/4 that number, but whose friends are separated as much as possible, right? Does that make sense somewhat? Okay.
And is this something that you've tested in the B2B world, B2C world? Does it make a difference?
This so far has all, like I mentioned, it's all been tested in a B2C world. I would be surprised to find out that similar results don't hold in a B2B type environment as well, but it would be interesting to look at. So let's explore. Oh, go ahead.
How did you determine who the people were that had a?
So in this case, right, because we have the Twitter network, right, we can actually go out and measure that. We can actually look at the network and we can say, this is how many friends they have, and then we can look, what we actually looked at for this, how disparate their friends were, we used a simple measure called clustering coefficient. And what clustering coefficient says is, how many friends of my friends are also my friends, right? And if that number is low, right, then that means that that's not the case, right, that they're spread out, right? If that number is high, it means I'm highly clustered, that all my friends know each other very well, right? And it's a very simple measure. It's nice because you don't need to know global information. You don't need to know all of Twitter in order to get that information. You just need to know local information about each of the people that you potentially might seed, right?
How did you determine that they were influencers in those networks?
That's a difficult question, and that's not something that we investigated in this particular work. There is other work that looks into that, and essentially there are ways to handle that question, which is to do things like surveying of the network, right? So this is commonly done. There's been a lot of work in drug detailing along these lines, where you go out and you investigate what physicians think other physicians are the most important influencers on their decision to make drug recommendations, right? To make drug prescriptions, not recommendations, right? That surveying work is often costly, but it turns out there's some ways that you can kind of combine. You can do what's called active surveying, where you do a couple of surveys and then you update your beliefs about who are the influential people in the network, go out and sample more individuals, and you can kind of congeal on who might be influencers. In this case, we actually, in this particular study, those other studies aside, in this particular study, we essentially are just looking at things like message passing, right? And so we're not really we're not really looking at how influential people are in terms of how trusting another individual is of that individual. And I'm going to get into that because that's actually the second half of this talk, is going to talk about trust a little bit. So,
right. Yeah. Maybe this will lead to that, I guess, question is, did you see that there was a difference between, so, especially when you're working with Twitter, right? You could theoretically measure, retweeting, right, as a measure of how influential someone is, meaning is the percentage of messages that comes from one person, retweeted more often could be an indicator of influence. For so I have 1 million friends, but the number of times my message is sent from one friend to another friend is only.
Yeah, so we didn't get into that at all in this particular discussion, but we are looking into that for future work. And like I said, this is almost all based upon simulation, right? And so we're not necessarily looking at actual behavior. As I mentioned, the model is grounded in a model that was compared to real behavior, but this particular results are not grounded in that same behavior. We are looking at that question, retweeting, mentioning, that kind of things, is for some future work that I can mention at the end. So let me just show you why this result makes sense, right? And the reason why it makes sense is that if you see just people who have the most friends, you'll notice they're almost all bedded in that one cluster, that big cluster we saw in the network, right? There's one individual out here for the optimal budget, right? If you see just people whose friends don't know each other, you get everyone at the outside of the network, right? And that doesn't work very well either, right? But if you combine them, what you get is a lot of people in the middle, and then you get some individuals scattered throughout the other different networks, right? And so this kind of gives this nice kind of wide dispersion across the entire network of seeding strategies. And part of the reason why this is the case is that social networks tend to be what we call highly assortative. In other words, individuals who have lots of friends know other individuals who have lots of friends, right? They don't know many individuals who don't have a lot of friends. And so what happens is that because all of the individuals who have lots and lots of friends are kind of cliquish in a way, right? It contains social contagion. It contains the influence that you're trying to spread to that particular central clique of your network and doesn't allow it to spread widely throughout the entire network, right? If you instead emphasize brokerage, or the ability for people to work between groups, like this individual right here, right, working between two major groups in the network, right, that allows the information to spread more widely through disparate groups in the network overall. So people with lots of friends know other people with lots of friends, which constrains social contagion, this fusion of products and ideas, right? The most influential people, if you measure it in terms of how impactful they are on the spread of ideas, are actually the people who have lots of friends, but friends don't know each other. But as we mentioned, this assumes that all the individuals, the current model assumption is that all the individuals trust each other equally, right? That's obviously a fallacious assumption, right? And so the next part of the work, which I'll talk about for the last 10 minutes or so, is in fact trying to understand how people learn to trust each other in social networks. So this is actually joint work with Hassam Sharara, who's a student that I worked with, who actually just defended his PhD dissertation yesterday and has passed successfully, so that's great news. He's going to go on and work at YouTube, so that'll work out well for him. And Lise Couture, who is a professor of social media, or a professor, sorry, of computer science in the computer science department at the University of Maryland. So here's the motivation, right? So this is kind of a very simple social network. And for those of you who have ever been on Groupon or Amazon or various things, you've probably at some point gotten something like, here's an online bookstore, a coupon, invite a friend, and get 10% off your next purchase, right? And so you have to make the decision, who should I invite, who should I send this to, right? And you know, we have Mary here, and Mary says, wow, I'm just going to send it to everyone because, you know, if someone accepts, then I get 10% off, right? So Mary sends this out. Anne and Janet love books, so they're happy to reply, and she gets her coupon, and it all works out well, right? But John and Bob are illiterate, or just don't like reading, or something along those lines, right? And so they think of Mary as being a spammer, right? That she's sending out spam messages, right? And so as a result of this, right, the trust that Anne and Janet have in Mary grows, the trust that Bob and John have in Mary goes down, right? John, on the other hand, gets a coupon for movierental.com, refer a friend to get $10 off your next movie rental. Apparently these are really expensive movie rentals. And he says, you know, so John's different than Mary. He's a little more selective. He says, Bob and Mary will definitely be interested. They like movies. However, I think Anne just stays at home and reads books all the time, so I'm not going to send her this coupon, right? So John sends it out to Bob and Mary. Bob and Mary respond positively to the message, right? As a result, their trust in John grows. He didn't send the message to Anne, so their trust isn't affected at all, right, by this decision. Over time, you know, you get a bunch of these. Mary sends out a bunch of these kind of promotions. She spams everyone. John gets a bunch of these, but he's very selective in who he sends these emails to, right? And as a result of this, everyone trusts John. No one trusts Mary. From a marketing standpoint, we want people to be like John, right? Because as a result, because we know when they send out these messages, right, then they're going to send them out to targets who are likely to reciprocate, right? Who are likely to engage with our brand and with our organization. We don't want people to be like Mary, right? Even though we might get a wider audience reach, right? We might spread it to more individuals. The truth of the matter is that if people are all like Mary, then our brand gets a bad reputation, right? It's being associated with this spammer who's out there sending out messages and flooding your inbox all the time, right? So we actually looked at this in another social network, not one that we had mentioned before, called Dig. And in Dig, what people are doing is they're sharing news stories, right? They find a news story they like on a website, they post it up, and all of their followers can see the news story and see what they're reading about, right? It's kind of just a quick list of every kind of news story you're interested in. And users can dig each other's stories, and by doing that, they're saying, "Oh, I really like this story," so they dig it and it votes it up in the story, right? And kind of one of the goals of every user on Dig is to get their story dug so many times that it makes it to the front page, right? So there's some social incentives, no financial incentives to this, right? So we can look at both the social network of who follows whom on Dig, and we can also look at the Dig network of which users liked which stories, right? And this was just something that interestingly came out naturally of the data. We found that if you looked at individuals who submitted stories on the same topic, so if you looked at people who both like technology, right? And you looked at individuals who didn't submit stories on the same topic, so you looked at some who submitted technology and some who submitted business, but who somehow wound up following each other for whatever reason. What we found was that over time, individuals who submit stories on the same topic tend to dig the same stories over time, right? So in other words, people who start out similar to each other, as a result of the Dig network, become more similar to each other over time, right? People who start out different than each other, right, that they were submitting stories on different topics, become less like each other over time, right? This seems to promote, to be an example of what we sometimes call a homophily in these networks, right? That people who like each other, people tend to form relationships with people that they have similar interests to them, right? It's also called, Eli Preischer has a book called The Filter Bubble, that claims that as a result of this, people are no longer getting balanced news about the world, right? Because people are consuming more of their news through social media, and so as a result, they're becoming more and more biased towards the things that they already find to be true about the world, right? There are some interesting ways around some of that, and we actually have some research we're doing about that, but that's a whole nother story that we don't really have time for today. So we built a model to try and take into account all these different things, like the fact that people have different interests in different particular products, right? The fact that Bob likes movies and Ann doesn't, right? And we also built something because we realized that the trust between individuals changes in time, right? A lot of the standard models of influence in social networks assume that if someone is an influential, they're always an influential, right? That's not the case, right? If someone starts to abuse their influential credibility, right, they quickly lose that influence over time. And so we built a model which kind of took into account both of these kind of ideas, and then we tried to predict adoptions in future stages, right? So what we did was we trained the model on 4 months of data from Dig, and then we tried to predict the last 2 months about who would be the most influential people, who would have the most effect on the overall network. And what we found was that with our model versus many of the standard models out there, when you take into account the fact people have different preferences for different product categories, and that trust changes in time, you can do a better job at predicting what adoptions will actually occur in the network than if you use kind of these standard measures, assuming that trust is always constant and things like that. Not too surprising, right? I don't want to, that shouldn't be shocking, right?
Explain the graph a little bit.
Oh, okay, sure. So what this is showing, so for almost all of these kind of models, right, you inevitably have false positives because you predict that something's going to happen for a particular threshold of adoption, right? You're going to assume that so many fraction of the network is going to adopt a particular product, right? And so for those predictions, you're going to have some false positives. You're going to predict some people who are going to adopt who actually didn't, right? And so a standard way to look at these results is the amount of false positives you get for the amount of true positives you actually successfully predict. So what we're showing is that for a very low false positive rate, we get a very high true positive rate, right? So a bad example of this would be for this line to be way down here at the bottom, because that would mean for a high false positive rate, you weren't predicting many true positives, right? So what we're showing is that in our model, we actually do a better job of predicting than two other models, the Bernoulli and Bernoulli partial credit model. those essentially assume that trust is constant over time, that it doesn't adapt to the situation at hand, right? They actually model the adoption process as a Bernoulli process, and then they basically look at a bunch of trials, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, and then infer what the Bernoulli, how biased the coin must be in order to make this. No problem. Sorry, I kind of skimmed over it at a very high level. I apologize for that. One interesting thing that came out of this, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, is that you can actually design new marketing incentives based upon this model, right? So the standard way to do viral marketing, those kind of coupons that I explained, is that you reward people for successful recommendations, right? But you don't punish them at all for making recommendations that don't get engaged in, right? And I should take back, we're not going to actually punish our consumers. We're not going to ever say that that's what we're doing, right? What we're going to do is just give them a reward at the end of the month that's kind of biased, that's biased in some way based upon how many emails they sent out, right? We're going to tell them this is what your overall reward is, right? Most existing viral marketing strategies assume that, in fact, all you do is give out rewards, you don't give out any punishments. What we found, and this is kind of interesting, is that if you balance reward and punishment, if you place half the weight on rewarding good recommendations and half the weight on penalizing bad recommendations, then you actually engage, and this is this yellow line here that's hard to see here, it's up there and down there, right? You actually get a higher level of adoption in the network overall, and you maintain a higher level of trust in the network. This is as opposed to the red line, which is kind of the standard everyone spams everyone kind of model, right? And the black line, is you only get penalized for making bad recommendations, you never get a reward, right? Well, in that case, you maintain trust really well in your network, right? Because no one ever recommends anything to anyone, right? But no one adopts anything, right? So this balancing notion, this kind of Goldilocks notion works really well. So essentially, we can make better predictions about adoption if we take into account heterogeneous preferences and dynamic trust. And we can create better mechanisms that encourage more trust within social networks. In fact, this exact work, we've now been talking to Living Social, right, which is a group coupon buying experience, about how they have a program they call Me+3, right, where you actually send out, if you get 3 of your friends to adopt, then you get the coupon, then you get the whatever you just purchased for free, essentially, right? Well, what we've been talking about is maybe we could tailor that based upon how well we know that that individual does in terms of spamming versus selectively sending out those emails, right? So maybe for the people who are more selective, we make that Me+2 or Me+1, right? And for those people who are spamming more, maybe we make that Me+4 or Me+5, right? And we kind of have this balancing notion that encourages people to actually engage in the right behavior in terms of sending out those adoptions. So with that, I want to end with, then we still have some time for questions, I think. And I did want to mention 2 things. We're going to be doing a digital marketing analytics roundtable that will be sponsored by the Center for Complexity in Business on June 21st. It's an invite-only event, but if you talk to me, if you're here today and you want to talk to me about it, I'm happy to get you an invite for it. That'll be downtown in DC in the Reagan building. We're going to have Living Social will be there, Teradata will be there, Information Insights, which is a big marketing analytics company, will be there. And a bunch of A Primo will be there as well, Aster Data. And the last thing I want to mention, and I talked a little bit jokingly about hiring young people from the Smith School for doing this. We're actually going to have an entire program devoted to this in the near future. We're going to be offering an MS in Marketing Analytics, which will launch in the fall of 2013, fall of 2013, right? But we're now looking for partners in that space. If you're interested in that, let me know. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer a few more questions if we have time. I don't know. Yeah?
Often the skeptic in the room, you put the positive, the marketing approach to a lot of this, but did you look at complaints? So I've got a Toyota with sticking gas pedal, or I don't like my bank.
Yeah.
Does the model work the same way?
So not any of this kind of stuff that I've talked about today have we looked at complaints necessarily. There tends to be this unfortunate natural bias in the innovation research to positive experiences, right? But we have looked at it in other contexts. So a great example, Mars is a company I've been working with, and one of the things that they talked to us about was nitro pet food. I don't know if you know about it, but they had a little bit of a scandal. They actually do make, besides making chocolate, they also make pet food, which is interesting. But they had a little bit of a scandal where there was some worry that their food was making dogs sick. It was almost completely fallacious, right? It turned out, but there was a bunch of blog buzz about this, right? And so what we did was we kind of looked at, well, if you knew that if you knew that there was a story out there on the blogosphere, right? Could you predict who might spread that story farther, right? And then with the potential that since you know that this story's wrong and that you have, they had things from the FDA, for instance, indicating that this was not something to be concerned about and stuff like that. Could you provide those bloggers with that information proactively to try and dissuade them from marrying? And what we found is we could actually do a fairly good job of predicting. We could, out of the tens of millions of bloggers out there, right, we could narrow down to a couple hundred that might be potentially about to post on this, which might be enough that you could then afford an email campaign to send out some emails with information to those bloggers, right? So we're looking at engagement interaction. DARPA actually just recently funded us to continue some of this research, right? And they're very interested in this idea. Like if we know that there's negative press about a particular activity, such as something in Afghanistan happening, right? Is there some way that we can combat that we can engage that? So I think that's a very good question, and it's kind of the next step of where we're going with this research.
So you talked, a lot of this sounded like B2C. You said there is, some applicability in the B2B arena.
Yeah.
I guess what we're struggling with at Energetics right now is moving from a space in which we know we have a lot of consultants who have their individual networks, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where the connections are made. But how do we, as an organization, then take that and leverage those connections?
Yeah.
And turn it into more of a...
That's interesting. I had
B2C for those.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that context in particular, but it strikes me as being almost exactly kind of the knowledge management question that often occurs in a lot of these spaces, right? Which is, how do I find the person who has the particular right connection, such that I need for this particular opportunity or this particular event, right? And that's an interesting question.
So maybe it's more of a targeted approach rather than saying every employee, please share your network with the company.
This is some place where you run into social barriers that might prevent that information from wanting to be shared, right? So then you come up with a question of how do you create the correct incentive structure within your organization such that people are willing to share that information, right? I know it's kind of a similar context, but one thing that Exxon, for instance, did in this space was they created knowledge brokers who would actually go from sub-organization to sub-organization within their overall organization, trying to spread information from one organization to another. They were specifically incentivized based upon how well that information got spread, right? So if you had some sort of incentive structure that would kind of encourage people to share that information, which is what Exxon essentially did, that might happen. Like, if you share a contact with this and it winds up, then you wind up getting, some finder's fee or percentage of something, right? Then that might be a good way to encourage that kind of information spread. I should mention briefly part of the reason why we don't spend a lot of time in B2B is it's really hard to get good data in B2B space. So if someone's willing to share some good data in the B2B space with us, we're happy to work with them.
Yeah, the crux of what we're trying to do is, and that may not be the approach, but is we know they have this. We know individuals have these networks. We as an entity do not have a social network. Right. So how do we, it seems to me the next logical step is to just capitalize on that.
Yeah, so maybe there's a way to kind of encourage them to organize that social network in some centralized way. It's an interesting problem. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Any comments on an analytic tool like Clout and also the state of sentient analysis?
A sentiment analysis? Yeah. So Clout, for those of you who don't know, is basically a tool out there that will analyze how influential you are on social media for you, right? And it'll tell you, it gives you a score. And people actually are making decisions based upon this. I recently heard of a CMO position that didn't get filled because the guy only had a cloud score of 20 and they were expecting at least a threshold of 45 or something like that, right? People are making decisions based on it. I think of these as, they're interesting measures. They're a little too simplistic compared to some of the stuff that we actually engage in when we actually look at how likely they are to occur. They're developing new techniques along these lines all the line, and so they're improving, don't get me wrong, right? But it's a very simplistic measure. The example I always pointed out is that Justin Bieber on Clout has a perfect score of 100. He's the only individual to attain that. He has twice the score of the Dalai Lama, right? And if you think about who might be more influential in the world, that's either a sad statement about the world as a whole, or it means that their measure isn't fully encompassing all
He's
the
the true Dalai Lama.
So regarding the B2B stuff, do you have any recommendations in terms of where we might go for any stuff we want to learn more in terms of how some of this stuff applies in the B2B world? The reason is because my company has a bit of a niche. I mean, we're security technology,
right,
so there's a lot of our employees as well tend to work in niche markets because they're very, IT network centric. We recently did, I have no idea how successful it was, but we're doing a lot of cloud technology related stuff. So we did some social media stuff, and we went the simple route where we gave out free swag. Right? So we said, if you recommend this or employees that do this, you get a free T-shirt. We got stuff like that. So we kind of went that route. And I'm just curious where we might look for other information ideas.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are a number of resources that I follow online. Most of them are kind of, I don't follow any that are specific to B2B, though I think Joseph's just mentioning that he do some
we've been talking about all the real shiny stuff, but business blogging, there's one, a site called b2bbloggers.com. It's run by Jeremy Victor, who lives in the Philadelphia area. There are a couple others that are, more platform specific. I would say, and it also depends on some of the people you can follow in the Twitter sphere. I'd be happy to show you some stuff after this.
Yeah, a lot of the best way to engage would be to actually follow other B2B companies that are doing this well, or that you think are doing this well, and then figure out who those are, and then see what they're doing, right? And just steal their best practices, basically, right? The one other one I would mention that generally covers this area really well in terms of a blog is Mashable. I love Mashable in terms of what they present. I mean, there's a lot of information that gets put up there that is kind of dubious, but there's a lot of really good content that they put up there as well, and it kind of gets you a great insight into some of these ideas.
Also Focus.com, which is like, what Quora is? Okay. Focus.com is more like a forum of professionals. You log in, you register, you ask a question, and your peers answer it for you.
Yeah.
We're trying to create that actually internally.
Yeah.
We're having people have individual pages where they say, ask me about, and then we try to create a social network.
I mean, this is essentially the knowledge management question that we were talking about, right? And I think it's funny because I did that like 12 years ago for Mitsubishi Chemical without social media, right? And now with social media around, this is becoming an even more and more popular idea, and I think it's a natural transition.
20 years ago we had Lotus Notes.
What?
Lotus Notes is an enterprise application. You ask your questions, and it's all hierarchical by category. And the enterprise.
We don't want to get into Lotus Notes.
And on that note, we're going to close out today. Thank you, Bill, so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it.